Welcome to the Good for America podcast. I'm your host, former Congressman Bob Good, former chair of the House Freedom Caucus. Let me remind you to subscribe to this podcast, rate the show, share it with your friends, and follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. The title of this podcast is Republicans Return from the August Recess Facing the September 30 Fiscal Deadline. So Republicans return today from a 5-week break, the annual August recess. They actually left a day early, you might remember, to avoid a possible forced vote on the release of the Epstein files. But they will still have to face a possible discharge petition by Thomas Massie, which would force a floor vote on the Epstein files. I don't think anybody can defend with integrity any resistance to releasing all of the Epstein files. But our focus is on the fiscal deadline approaching September 30, Republicans returning from the August recess after 5 weeks without having passed their 12 required annual spending bills. So over the last 5 weeks, when Republicans have been gone, many of the members literally took a vacation. Some of them traveled their district. Some of them did a mix of the above. But what they didn't do was stay in Washington to work on the required 12 annual appropriation bills. This has long been promised by speakers, going back to McCarthy and then Johnson last year, that they wouldn't go on the August recess if they hadn't passed their 12 bills. Of course, they did that, and they're in no position now to pass these 12 bills by the end of September. They don't even seem to be pretending or even talking about it. And sadly and unfortunately, this is as we predicted. We said this back when this podcast began at the 1st of June and throughout the reconciliation process, that they weren't even talking about the 12 required annual appropriations bills, and they weren't going to pass those once again as predicted. I'm sorry to be right on this. And this is with the news that the deficit last month in July, the last month for which we have numbers, was a whopping $291 billion. That is a new record outside of COVID, that the deficit in July was a record $291 billion. That's about 20% higher than July of last year when it was $242 billion. This is under Republican full control of government. This is on the Republicans' watch. They own this record $291 billion monthly deficit in July. Folks, we are going in the wrong direction on spending, deficits, and debt. The Republicans failed us back in December of last year, December of 24, when under pressure from President Trump, quite frankly, along with Speaker Johnson, they passed a year-end CR that didn't cut spending. As a matter of fact, it increased spending that funded the government through March of this year. They promised to do things differently when they had full control of government starting in January. Instead, they passed another CR, continuing resolution, in March, funding the government through the end of this fiscal year, through September 30. And they are once again failing to do their most basic, most fundamental job. So let's set the table once again on what we're talking about with the funding of the government and the 12 required annual appropriation bills. Congress is required by statute to pass 12 individual appropriation bills every year by September 30 to fund the government, meaning the whole funding of the government operation breaks down into these 12 spending bills. The fiscal year runs from October 1st to September 30. So the 2025 fiscal year ends at the end of this month on September 30, after which theoretically the funding of the government expires without new legislation. But this Congress is only scheduled to work 14 days this month in September. And it's not even really 14 days because only 6 of those are full days, meaning 4 of those are what you call a fly-in day on a Monday or Tuesday where they fly into or travel into Washington, and they don't have anything official on their schedule until 6:30 that evening. They do a couple of votes in the evening on the fly-in day. That counts as one of their days. And then 4 of their 14 days are what are called fly-out days. And those typically end by noon. So you usually have votes at like 10 in the morning, and then they're on their way to their cars, to the airport, to the train station by noon on the fly-out day. So really, they've got 6 real working days in Washington this month to theoretically work on the funding of the government or the 12 annual appropriations bills. So obviously they're not serious about even trying here. But what is supposed to happen? What is supposed to happen, and what did Speaker Johnson promise last year and promise once again this year that Congress would do? So again, the new fiscal year begins on October 1, and there are the 12 required appropriations bills that total, unfortunately right now, about $1.7 trillion to cover what is called discretionary spending. That's the spending that has to be voted on and appropriated every year. It doesn't include what's called mandatory spending, which consumes all of the $5 trillion in tax revenue. Again, some basic math here. The federal government is taking in about $5 trillion a year of your tax revenue, and they're spending about $7 trillion, and we're running, again, more than a $2 trillion annual deficit. Actually, if we keep spending the way we are now with July, which was almost $300 billion, that would be well over a $3 trillion deficit in a non-COVID year. But so they exempt mandatory spending. They don't even vote on that every year. We'll come back to mandatory in a moment. But the mandatory spending is about $5 trillion, meaning it takes up all of the federal revenue. And then they vote on, in theory at least, the spending of what's called discretionary, the 12 different spending areas that are that make up the normal operations of the government. Mandatory, back to that for a moment, is Social Security, Medicare, which is insurance for seniors, Medicaid, which is insurance supposedly for those who are disabled or young pregnant women with young children or mothers with young children, or those who are unable to take care of themselves, but it's been expanded massively to include lower income folks. But Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, what we pay on the $37 trillion in debt of about $1 trillion a year in interest, and other things, primarily veterans benefits. All that comes to about $5 trillion. That's not even voted on every year. That's on autopilot. That's not part of the annual 12 spending bills. Mandatory spending, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, interest on the debt, veterans benefits are on autopilot. So Congress members don't have to take tough votes on those. They don't have to authorize or appropriate the money for those every year. They're just on autopilot. And those are exploding and growing, quite frankly. And frankly, on a fiscal side, from a fiscal standpoint, President Trump has done a great disservice to the country by saying the mandatory spending is off the table. We're not going to look at Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, because it's unpopular to address those, or it's politically risky to address those. And those are exploding and growing. They're unsustainable. They're going bankrupt. And he's just said, we're going to take those off the table. And of course, members of Congress don't want to vote on those because they're up for re-election every 2 years. But then that leaves the discretionary, the 12 required bills to fund the government by September 30. There's 12 individual bills that, in order, here's the 12 bills, from the largest to the smallest, that are theoretically, again, supposed to be passed as individual bills. There's about 8. These are last year's numbers, the expiring year. Defense, which is $833 billion. That's the biggest number, $833 billion. Look for that to grow under Republicans and President Trump. Then the next one is labor, Health and Human Services, and Education. That's $187 billion, most of which is no appropriate role of the federal government constitutionally. The next biggest one is Military Construction and VA, or Veterans Administration. That's $148 billion. Then there's Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development, $90 billion. I would submit the federal government shouldn't be in the transportation and housing business. Then there's Commerce, Justice, and Science, $78 billion. That's Department of Commerce, that's the Justice Department, and some of the things the federal government does in the area of science. There's Homeland Security, $65 billion. Energy and Water, $59 billion. State Department, Foreign Operations, a lot of that shouldn't be done, $52 billion. Interior and Environment, most of that certainly shouldn't be done. That's $38 billion. Agriculture, $26 billion. That's your farm subsidies. A lot of that shouldn't be done either. Then there's Financial Services, $24 billion. And then finally, the legislative branch, Congress's own budget, which is $7 billion. Altogether, that totals about $1.7 trillion on an annual basis. And again, these are 12 individual bills that are supposed to be voted on separately so that members of Congress can debate them, they can amend them, they can add things, they can take things out. They have to stand on their own merits. You actually have time to read them, and they have to be reconciled between the House and the Senate. That's what's supposed to happen. But not since 1997 have 12 individuals passed. And it's important to note, in 1997, the last time it happened, the debt was only about $5 trillion compared to today's $37 trillion. So what does Congress do instead? Instead of doing 12 individual spending bills, the spending and the debt grows, you might say explodes, because they do continuing resolutions, which is theoretically, they call it a CR, where you just keep spending at the same levels and maybe have a little bit of few tweaks to it, but you don't really change it much. Or you do an omnibus where you put all 12 together in one big bill. Or you do a couple, 2 or 3 mini buses where you group them together, 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 bills at a time. These are the proverbial thousands of pages that nobody can read. It's impossible to read. You don't know what's in them and what's out of them, what you're voting for, what you're not voting for. But that's by design. That is not a bug in the system. That is a feature of the system for Congress. Package them all together so nobody can read them. Wait till the last moment before there's a shutdown crisis and say, hey, they got to pass. These are must-pass bills, must-pass legislation, because there's something in it for everybody, even if you don't like all of it and you would do it differently if it was just you. You got to, for the good parts that you like, you got to take the bad parts you don't like. And after all, we can't shut down the government. Why not? Hey, we can't shut down the government, so we got to keep things working for us, even though they're not working for the American people. In fact, a recent government accountability, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office, came out with a report that says that there's 1,300 unauthorized programs still funded by the federal government for about $500 billion, $500 billion. So in the current funding of the government that's just been perpetuated with continuing resolutions and omnibuses and minibuses over the last 30 years, there's 1,300 unauthorized programs, meaning they're not authorized or approved by Congress anymore, that total about $500 billion that are included in that $1.7 trillion discretionary spending. So in other words, over the years, over the decades, when Congress would authorize money for something and then appropriate it, they would typically authorize it for a period of time, for 5 years or 10 years or whatever, so that you could come back and assess it, evaluate it, see if it's meeting the original mission of what it was intended for. Is the money being spent responsibly? Of course it isn't. Or does it need to be changed or modified because of other circumstances that have changed? Well, again, about 1,300 of these programs, the authority for those, the authorization has expired, and Congress still keeps giving the money, primarily, again, through CRs and omnibuses and minibuses. And that's about 30%, $500 billion, of the $1.7 trillion in discretionary spending. And of the $500 billion, 60% of it, or about $300 billion, the authorization expired more than 10 years ago. That's one of the things that I and my conservative colleagues in the Freedom Caucus fought over the last 4 years when I was there, was to not appropriate money for programs that were no longer authorized, where Congress didn't vote to say, hey, these are still valid, these are still necessary, these are still an appropriate use of taxpayer money, they're accomplishing the mission for which they were intended. No, they're on autopilot, and they just get wrapped into, folded in these big appropriations bills that are packaged together in a CR or omnibus, and that's how you get to $37 trillion in debt through the bipartisan, uniparty spending, where the Republicans and the Democrats join together, reach across the aisle, keep the government open, don't allow a government shutdown, and just keep borrowing and spending your hard-earned dollars, ruining the fiscal future of your kids and your grandkids. So again, the debt was about $5 trillion 30 years ago in 1997, the last time that there was actually 12 individual spending bills passed. So it's went from $5 trillion over that 30 years to $37 trillion now. If that kind of growth happens over the next 30 years, we'll be at $237 trillion in debt. Let me say that again. The last time we passed where Congress did their job and passed 12 individual spending bills back in 1997, nearly 30 years ago, 28 years ago to be exact, the debt was 5 trillion. Now it's 37 trillion. That kind of percentage growth, that exponential growth to go from 5 trillion to 37 trillion over 28 years, if that happens again over the next 28 years, then our debt would be $237 trillion. The interest on the debt would go from the 1 trillion we're paying now to over $6 trillion, which is nearly 100% of our current budget, meaning we're only taking in 5 trillion, we're spending 7 trillion. Well, the interest in the next 28 years would be $6 trillion at the current trajectory, consuming all of the current revenue, more than the current revenue. But it'd actually be worse than that because undoubtedly you have higher interest rates because of the higher debt and the riskier debt situation. That's if we don't have a fiscal collapse between now and then, which we probably would. So the interest rates would go up even higher. And think about what that does on tens, if not hundreds of trillions of dollars of federal debt in terms of the payment on the debt. Think of how much harm higher interest rates are causing on Americans, on you perhaps, on your mortgage payment, and how much worse that is when you scale it to the whole of the federal government and the whole of the national debt. So we've been operating on continuing resolutions, CRs. Republicans have, since Democrats had full control of government before they lost the House in 2022, and Republicans took the House. And by the way, I'll say it once again, Republicans, when we won the House in 22 and then therefore had the House in 23, 24, we could have shut down and defunded and ended the funding for all of Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer's policies. We could have stopped them dead in their tracks if Republicans just had courage and had principle and were willing to shut down the government if necessary to stop funding the things that we campaigned against and we say we stand against. But instead, Republicans with the House kept doing CRs with Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, Mike Johnson and Kevin McCarthy reaching across the aisle and agreeing to keep the government open and keep things on autopilot. So we are still operating under Democrat spending levels and Democrat policies since they had full control of government under Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer. And that, again, includes the continuing resolution, or CR, that was passed by Republicans with full control of government back in March, funding the government through September of this year. And Republicans along the way, of course, make their promises about next time and how things will be different. Last year, they kept promising to us and the conservatives in the House, hey, it'll be different if we can get the Senate and the White House. They promised they wouldn't be doing continuing resolutions anymore. They would do 12 individual spending bills. When they did a CR back in March to fund the government through September, they said, okay, well, we'll cut spending in the reconciliation process, the just recently completed big ugly bill back in July, because we only need 50 votes. We don't have to have 60 votes in the Senate. And of course, they didn't cut spending in the reconciliation package. Then there was the promise, oh, we'll do another reconciliation bill by the end of the year. And they've abandoned that. They're not even talking about that anymore. So this was and is the year for Republicans to address the spending, to address the debt, to address the deficit with the momentum Republicans have, with President Trump having won, taking back the Senate, keeping the House. Democrats are at historic lows in terms of popularity or unpopularity. They're a weak party dominated by the radical left wing. And there's no election this year. So this was the year for Republicans to show principle, to show courage, and to do what they said they would do. And they're failing to do that. So here we are, Republicans back in D.C., Congress back in D.C., with a fiscal deadline on September 30. So what happens on October 1 if there's not a funding mechanism passed? Then theoretically there's a government shutdown. What does that mean? It's not really a government shutdown. It's called a government shutdown, but it's not really a government shutdown. If the government funding were to expire at the end of September, then come October 1, only what's considered essential operations would continue. But the federal employees don't get paid, meaning the October 15 pay period, federal employees wouldn't get paid because there's a government shutdown. Now, historically, they always get back pay, and they pay them for whether they're considered non-essential and they don't come to work, or whether they do come to work and have to work without a paycheck. Then Congress has always come back and paid them. What should Republicans do? Number one, Republicans ought to buckle down, nose to the grindstone, and pass 12 conservative Republican bills, even if it takes beyond September 30, that actually cut spending and put us on a path to fiscal responsibility and implement conservative policy. Because again, we're operating under not only the Democrat spending levels from they had full control of government, that's bankrupting the country. All $1.7 trillion of discretionary money is all borrowed. So it's not only the dollars, but it's the policies. We're still funding the policies that Biden, Pelosi, and Schumer put in place, because it's the spending bills that determine what is funded and what's not funded. Republicans should pass 12 conservative Republican bills that cut spending and implement conservative policy, the things that Republicans ran on, and dare the Democrats to enact a Schumer shutdown. What that means is the Republicans can pass conservative bills out of the House with a simple majority. Let's actually do what the conservatives want. Let's cut the spending and implement the conservative policy. And then you need 60 votes in the Senate, so Chuck Schumer theoretically can block it, but it would be a Schumer shutdown if President Trump's ready to sign what the House passes and 53 or more than 50 Republicans in the Senate are ready to vote for it and to pass it. Then it falls on Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer caved on the CR and kept the government operating back in March of last year, and I think he would cave in September because Democrats, again, are addicted to government, and they don't want federal employees working and not getting paid. And then the budget director, Russ Vought, Trump's budget director, the director of OMB, Office of Management and Budget, can declare all government employees essential, and Democrats rather ought to agree with that, because when President Trump is trying to scale back the federal workforce, the Democrats are screaming, hey, you can't lay off any federal workers, which must mean they're all essential. So they should declare that they're all essential, so they all have to report to work, and let the Democrats know if they don't keep the government technically open and funded, then they're not going to pay the federal employees the back pay for the time period that there's not the funding of the government. Republicans can bring to the floor votes to pay those serving in defense, safety, and security, and allow Democrats to vote on whether or not to pay those individuals, meaning the military, Homeland Security, Border Patrol, ICE, federal law enforcement, air traffic control, those sorts of things. But really, unless it's just for political reasons, Democrats shouldn't oppose a CR, another CR, if that's what Republicans do. Hopefully they'll pass the 12 bills, but I don't think there will be a shutdown if Republicans do a CR, which they should not do, because Democrats will vote for a CR to keep their own policies and spending levels in place. So again, Republicans shouldn't do a CR. They should pass 12 individual spending bills. All of this is why it was an unforgivable failure for Republicans not to address the fiscal crisis in reconciliation. They raised the debt limit by $5 trillion. They passed a bill that did have $1 trillion in spending cuts over 10 years, but that's $100 billion a year. Again, we had almost a $300 billion deficit in July alone. But the tax cuts total some $5 trillion. And again, the tax cuts are mostly expiring halfway through the 10 years, and the spending cuts don't kick into the latter part of the 10 years in the reconciliation bill. This was an unforgivable failure for Republicans, President Trump, Speaker Johnson, Majority Leader Thune in the Senate, when they could do whatever they wanted with a simple majority in both houses. Because now you've got the midterms threatening, and Republicans are afraid of next year's election when the party in power typically loses seats. But so from a fiscal standpoint, Republicans are fiddling as America's fiscal future is burning, to use a metaphor. Republicans are fiddling as America's fiscal future is burning. It's getting worse on Republicans' watch. Why do they do it? Why do Republicans continue to do what Democrats do on the spending side? Because we let them do it. Because we, the voters, and particularly Republican voters, let them do it. We have to demand that our elected representatives do their number one job. And the number one job of the Congress, especially the House, is to protect the nation's finances, the nation's fiscal stability, to protect and facilitate an economy that allows private business and private enterprise to thrive, to protect the nation's ability to borrow when necessary, to reduce the debt and the deficit, cut the spending, ensure our ability to meet our obligations. And Congress, and Republicans in particular, they have the majority, they have control, are failing us massively. They need to stop doing that which is not authorized in the Constitution. So we're funding all this stuff that's not an appropriate role of the federal government. The Constitution only gives the federal government about 20 specific powers, and most of this $1.7 trillion in spending on the discretionary side, not to mention most of the things that are being done on the mandatory side, are not an appropriate role of the federal government anyway. Republican leadership, President Trump and Republican leadership need to stop attacking the few courageous conservatives who are fighting on principle to cut spending and are willing to provide some resistance to the uniparty spending spree. We need to start pressuring the moderates, the liberal Republicans, the ones who are in the Don't Cut Anything caucus, the DCAC. The conservative members of Congress need to be willing to vote no against bad Republican spending bills. Otherwise, it's just noise. If you talk about it and you express your resistance and your concern, but ultimately you vote yes, then it's just noise. It doesn't matter. You got to be like Thomas Massie and Rand Paul and be willing to vote no. But these Republicans in the House and the Senate, they won't do this unless we make them. They have to fear us at the ballot box. That means in the primary for Republicans, we need to primary Republicans who aren't cutting spending and elect instead a true, courageous conservative as our Republican representative. If it's a Democrat that represents us, then we need to vote him out and replace him with a Republican who says they're going to cut spending. That is our role as a people in helping to keep the republic to which we've been entrusted. So thanks for joining again this episode of the Good for America podcast. Please remember to subscribe to the show, to rate it and share it with your friends, and follow me on social media at Rep Bob Good. Thanks for joining us. Let's keep the republic.